The return registers first as an interruption of a story other people had already finished writing. In the interval of absence, the narrative had hardened quickly. Conclusions were drawn with confidence, theories multiplied, certainty settled in that the quiet equaled conclusion, that the lack of visible motion equaled surrender, that the empty space meant the work had ended. People who had remained cautious while activity was obvious grew suddenly fluent once the activity paused. Opinions that had stayed private became public. Predictions that would have required courage to voice in real time were offered freely once the subject appeared safely distant. That interval of interpretation was useful. It revealed more than any direct confrontation could have. Absence functions as a selective solvent. It dissolves performance and leaves residual behavior easier to read. Those who had been waiting for an ending announced themselves. Those who had treated the work as entertainment rather than substance became visible through the tone of their commentary. Those who had remained quietly consistent also became visible, though their visibility required no spectacle. The distinction between the two groups required no announcement. It simply accumulated in the record of who spoke and how. Silence itself had been misread. To observers accustomed to constant signal, the lack of signal registered as vacancy. The assumption was that if movement could not be tracked in real time, then movement had ceased. Patience is frequently illegible to people who equate visibility with progress. What looked like stillness from the outside contained continuous observation, recalibration, and decision. The timing of reappearance was not reactive. It was selected. The curtain does not open because the audience demands it. It opens when the person behind it determines the conditions are sufficient. The discomfort that greets a return is more instructive than any celebration of absence. Failure, or the appearance of it, produces a peculiar comfort in certain observers. It confirms prior doubts. It stabilizes a hierarchy in which the observer remains safely above the observed. Disappearance supplies confidence. Return removes both. The person declared finished is no longer finished. The story requires revision in real time. And revision is rarely comfortable for those who had already invested in the earlier ending. The calm of the returning figure compounds the difficulty. Desperation would have been easier to dismiss. Visible need for vindication would have supplied familiar footing. Steady continuation without the request for applause or apology leaves fewer handholds. The motive for continuing requires no elaborate defense. Approval was never the prerequisite. The work was not suspended pending collective permission to resume. It was never dependent on the conversion of skeptics. The simple fact of ongoing presence is itself the disruption. People who had treated their opinions as binding verdicts discover that opinions do not write endings for other people's timelines. The authority to close a story belongs to the person living it. That discovery produces a secondary quiet among some of the loudest earlier voices. Confidence that flourished in absence proves more fragile once presence resumes. Memory of the interim commentary remains available without the weight of anger. Anger consumes attention that can be used elsewhere. What remains is clearer data about which relationships were conditional on perpetual forward motion and which were sturdy enough to tolerate pause. The pause also recalibrated internal metrics. Applause is easier to evaluate for sincerity once its absence has been survived. Concern is easier to sort into genuine and strategic once the period of non-response has filtered the field. People who reappear with sudden warmth, once permanence of absence is disproved, become legible in ways they were not before. The information is durable. Once patterns of self-interest have been observed under low-stakes conditions, they rarely require relearning. The altered vision that accompanies return is not dramatic reinvention. It is closer to corrected focus. Details previously tolerated become harder to ignore. The cost of certain conversations becomes clearer. The value of selective engagement rises. Energy previously spent on preemptive explanation or reputational maintenance becomes available for the actual work. The shift is less about becoming harder and more about becoming less available for unnecessary negotiation. People who require continuous convincing are released from the obligation to be convinced. That release is reciprocal. The person who stops performing the labor of persuasion recovers the capacity to direct attention toward construction rather than defense. Motivation supplied by doubt is efficient precisely because it does not require the doubter's continued participation. Each public declaration of finality becomes independent fuel. The engine does not need the original speakers to remain present or even aware of their contribution. Once internalized, the material converts into forward motion that no longer references its source. The resulting posture is difficult to govern from the outside. Permission becomes irrelevant. The individual who has already absorbed the experience of being underestimated, dismissed, and prematurely eulogized no longer requires external authorization to continue. That independence registers to observers as unpredictability, though from the inside it feels closer to simplicity. Entertainment value exists in the asymmetry. One side remains preoccupied with interpretation, prediction, and retrospective justification. The other side remains occupied with the next increment of work. Commentary and creation operate on different clocks. Speculation consumes the attention of the spectator. Execution consumes the attention of the participant. The gap widens over time. Attempts to determine the next move through external analysis consistently lag behind the moves themselves. Comebacks rarely announce their full shape in advance. They become undeniable through accumulation rather than declaration. Strength is not claimed. It becomes difficult to overlook. Change is not argued. It is encountered. Old assessments are not debated point by point. They are rendered descriptively obsolete by continued output. The most effective response to sustained underestimation is not symmetrical engagement. It is the refusal to divert resources into the engagement. Attention remains a finite currency. Every interval spent in rebuttal is an interval withheld from progress. Silence, steady production, and visible results impose a higher cost on the observer than any direct reply. The observer is left to reconcile the earlier narrative with the emerging evidence without assistance. That reconciliation is private, and therefore more corrosive to the original confidence. Questions about persistence, about the failure of the predicted collapse, about the apparent increase in composure, remain unanswered by design. The absence of explanation forces the observer to supply their own, and the available explanations are rarely flattering to the earlier stance. The error was categorical. Silence was filed under surrender. Absence was filed under weakness. Patience was filed under defeat. Each filing is now subject to empirical correction. The correction does not require the original filers to concede on record. Their continued attention supplies the concession. The work resumes without the burden of converting every skeptic, without the demand for perfect conditions, and without the pretense of final mastery. Continuation itself is sufficient. One additional cycle of effort, one additional visible increment, one additional decision to remain in motion, is often enough to destabilize a premature ending. Supporters who maintained quiet consistency through the interval require no elaborate recognition. Their steadiness was noted. Those who treated the pause as terminal and prepared their commentary accordingly are free to retain whatever response the return provokes. Discomfort, confusion, renewed scrutiny, or continued dismissal all remain available options. None of them alter the underlying schedule. The timeline was never collective property. The authority to resume was never distributed for vote. The stage was never dismantled. The lighting was simply brought down for an interval long enough to separate signal from noise. With the lights restored, the distinction remains visible. Those who preferred the narrative of conclusion are welcome to their preference. Preference does not overwrite presence. The work continues by the same logic that sustained it before the pause. Incremental, largely uninterested in real-time approval, and oriented toward horizons that do not require consensus to remain valid. The author of the timeline has not finished writing. That single fact is the entire announcement required.